Well, I remember my sister's baking bars and that the day before, or the night of the party or whatever, and then they were laughing and teasing my oldest sister and her boyfriend were going out that night to the party, and then the other two girls were going along, and they were teasing the oldest one, Anita, about locking the door so that she had to knock when she came in, so Mom and Dad would wake up and know what time she came in the morning. So then my mom had said when the priest came to the door then to tell them about the death and the accident and that, she was thinking it was the girl, Anita, knocking on the door to let her in. And so then when she saw the priest's face, and she said, it must be serious, and he said, you better get Jay. But the first I remember hearing about the accident was my older sister, who was 12 at the time, grabbed me by the leg and shook me awake, and it was about 6 in the morning, and said, we need to get up and clean the house and that, because Anita and Mary Lou were killed in an accident last night, and Irene's in the hospital. I remember pulling the blankets over my head, crying like, and then getting up and going to work. It's made a mess, but they knew people were coming over. We have to get up and get some work done and that. So it was kind of business as usual, but this has taken place. Well, and I'm sure my mom knew people would be coming over. They had to head into town to see my sister, of course, in the hospital, make funeral arrangements. They knew all of that, I'm sure, as they're kind of setting us up. But yeah, so it didn't really come from my parents or anything, it came from my sister. Must have been 11, he was 10, I was 8, a 7, a 6, a 3, 18-month, and then my mom was 8 months pregnant at the time. And then we had a hired man who had lived with us for years and years. He was part of the family, but he was there too.
Okay.
So he was there with us when my mom and dad left. But I know we weren't up long, and then our neighbor lady, who her son was the one they had the party for, called, and it was about 6:30 in the morning that she called to talk to my mom, and it wasn't until later why she called, but she called and my sister answered, and she said, is your mother there? And she said, no, Mom and Dad had to go to Jamestown, and Anita and Mary Lou were killed in an accident last night, and Irene's in the hospital. She said, oh, I'm sorry, and hung up the phone. And then it was only about half an hour to an hour, and her two daughters, who were the same ages as my sisters, one had just graduated with the oldest one that was killed, and then one was the same age as Irene. And those two girls came over, and then of course they helped mop floors and bake. They baked a cake, and and so we did stuff, and then more neighbors came. Then we have some more neighbors to the east that came over to help, and so more people came, and it wasn't until about, I think, 2 in the afternoon, because I remember people had brought hot dish over already, cakes, cupcakes, and I think it was like a 2 or 3 in the afternoon that my mom and Dad got home. And I remember saying to my mom, because it was always, we were a big, strong Catholic family, and Mom, we didn't even go to church today, and it's Sunday, and she said, that's all right, your dad and I went for you. We went and stuff like that. And I remember Mom and Dad afterwards, I just kind of said, I never remember seeing my dad cry. And every time my mom cried, I remember we cried. Like when she went to take the bedding off of the bed, and that the neighbors were helping her wash laundry and get things, beds made up for company and stuff. And one of them said, why don't you let me do it? And she goes, no, I can go do it. And she went in there and came back out crying and said, I just can't. And I remember, I'm sorry, I remember when she cried, then we cried. And that was the first I saw her cry, was when she went to get the bedding. And then I believe I'm trying to think of when maybe her mom and Dad got there, because my grandparents came and that, I remember that, and relatives and that. But it didn't, and then I remember going through the funerals and the double funerals and that, and I never saw her cry then, and I don't think any of us did during the funerals until after we were in the car to follow the hearses to the cemetery. And I think the 2 hearses leaving is when she did. Very strong parents home. I mean, it just amazes me to this day. I think they drew strength from each other, from their faith, from their, it's not that they didn't question why this happened, but I don't know. But I can remember things, like when we went in to view the bodies for the first time, we stopped at the hospital beforehand. Well, that was in the old days when anybody under 13 could go in. So none of us could go up to the hospital to see our sister, who was still alive.
Really?
No, yeah, that was the rule if you were under 13. So all of us waited in the car and thought, I wonder which room she's in. And so it was actually like 2 whole weeks before we even got to see Irene.
Oh.
So, kind of the reality to be reassured that she was okay was kind of, I don't know. See, and then she never got to go to the funerals or anything. So I think it was tough. She didn't have that closure like we did, I had never been to a funeral before. So this double funeral was my first funeral ever. So I wasn't sure what to expect as a child. And I think the realization, of what actually had happened, or our roles really changed in the family too, because it used to be the 3 older girls and then us. They were basically in charge of, we helped clean, but they helped with the majority of the cleaning, the cooking, that kind of thing. Well, then the roles reversed. Irene wasn't there for a while, so then my sister, who was 11, myself at 8, and my sister, who was 7, we started cooking the meals. You cooked for 12. You did the dishes, you did the cleaning. So I said, there's no wonder we all have a really good work ethic and knew how to work and pitch in and do things together. You just had to. And so yeah, I said I learned how to make hamburgers and roasts and potatoes and bake, and you had to.
Wow.
And we were the kind of typical family at that time. The boys were more the take the garbage out and those kinds of chores. The girls were more the house, the cleaning, not that they didn't have to pick up their stuff, but those were kind of the roles you played. And then of course we saw the newspaper articles, but I think we were somewhat protected too. Because I remember going back to school, and of course school had started late that week because of all the accidents, and the Cleveland community had lost 5 kids. Because it was my 2 sisters, then the 2 Bob Hendricks and Ron Lindsted. And I remember Ron Lindsted, I remember Bob Hendricks, I remember, we went to school with his sister, Bob's sister. And then Earl Williams I did know, because he went to school at Jameson, but he was from south of Cleveland too, so that small community had lost 5 teenagers basically. So it was quite an impact. And I remember going back to school, and I was talking with one of my best friends, and she said, we're not really supposed to say anything to you about it. And I'm sure the teacher had prepared them, because we came back to school one day later than the other kids had after Labor Day because of the funeral and stuff. And she had said, I'm sure prepared them and said, don't ask questions, don't, do anything. So when I started talking about her, she says, we're not really supposed to talk about it. And so it was kind of like, oh, okay. And I said, but what if I want to talk? I said, but you won't get in trouble if I want to talk about it. And so that's kind of, but I didn't share a lot with the other kids, but I also learned, I think, from that friend, some of the rumors, how the girls were actually identified. The only way that they knew, I think the only identification was Mary Lou, my sister that was a sophomore, had a letter in her pocket from a cousin, first cousin, that had her name on it. But they didn't have IDs, they didn't have, they didn't have driver's license at that time, so.